Welcome to the PrimateCast. I'm your host, Chris Martin,
And I'm Andrew McIntosh.
and today we're going to talk to Janet Nackoney.
Yeah, so we're going to talk to Janet about GIS, geospatial mapping, and her conservation-oriented work in Africa. So Janet's a research assistant professor in the Department of Geographical Sciences at the University of Maryland, where she received her PhD last year. And she's been working for quite a number of years now in Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was invited in November of 2012 to the primate research here at Kyoto University as part of a Asia-Africa platform workshop held by Dr. Takeshi Furuichi here.
Right, and she came because she's an expert at computer software dealing with mapping.
That's right. So she's been involved in that project. She'll talk about it later in the interview, specifically in terms of habitat suitability modeling for bonobo populations and other ape populations, as well as kind of fostering the development of land use planning and conservation programs involving local people in Africa as well.
Yeah, and it was nice to have her here at the PRI and also the other members of the workshop that she taught
That's
who were
right.
from Africa.
Yeah, so she was here imparting her knowledge in GIS and spatial modeling, and part of a couple of the participants were people you knew from Africa as well.
Yeah, so some of the guides from Bosu, which is the field site that I've been to and visited in West Africa with chimpanzees, a couple of the guides from Bosu came to Japan, so it was really interesting. You know, when I go there, they kind of introduced me to the village and the culture, and so I was kind of able to show them around here, which was really cool.
Yeah, it would be a nice kind of reciprocating relationship here for a
We
change.
went to Denny's.
To Denny's. The very traditional Japanese restaurant.
Yeah, right, the American Japanese restaurant.
Okay, so anyway, here's Janet talking about how she first got involved with Dr. Furuichi.
I met Dr. Furuichi in the field, actually, back in 2009 when I was in my field site in Northern Democratic Republic of the Congo. I was working on some participatory mapping methods with local communities for a land use planning initiative. And we started talking because Dr. Furuichi was on his way to his field site where he studies bonobos. It's located about 3 hours by motorbike south of where I was staying in the forest, in the rainforest. And I told him how much I enjoyed Japan because I had visited Japan in the past. And he and I formed a friendship, and we started to collaborate on bonobo mapping projects. So in the end, I was able to come out to a meeting in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Kinshasa to meet with different bonobo researchers. And together with Max Planck Institute, we collected all of the bonobo observation data that have been collected across the bonobo range since 2002. And we were able to put that into a geographic database and start a process of creating a spatial model to map the habitat suitability of the bonobo across the range.
Can you talk a little bit about that? So what exactly is a habitat suitability analysis?
So habitat suitability mapping, also called species distribution modeling. Basically, you're looking at a presence or sometimes also absence of a particular species. The biologist walks a transect line in the forest and makes observations about either direct or indirect observations of the particular species of interest, in this case a bonobo. And with that data, the data are assigned geographic coordinates using a global positioning system, a GPS unit. And we're able to take that data of knowing where the bonobos have been spotted or observed in the field. And in the GIS, the Geographic Information System, we can then start comparing the locations of those observations to the surrounding environmental conditions that promote the occurrence of that species in that particular location. And once we analyze the statistical relationship, we can then extrapolate a model to create a suitability map of where that species might be able to be found in other parts of the range that might not have yet been surveyed.
Well, what's kind of the end goal of that project that you're working on?
Yeah, so now that all of those bonobo researchers have come together, we've now taken the analysis that we did together in the workshop and are developing a paper for peer review. There are about 45 different co-authors on the paper, and these are all different bonobo researchers from different parts of the range who have donated their data to the effort.
As well as trackers on the ground.
And we're including trackers on the ground too.
So what was that like to get everybody's involvement? Especially putting a paper together is a lot of work, so
yes.
You need everybody's okay by the end of it.
You do need everybody's okay, and unfortunately a lot of them don't speak much English or read much English, so we actually were able to work with Max Planck Institute and get a translation provided for those Francophone authors so that they could read and understand what was happening in the paper and agree to its publication.
Well, Janet, congratulations on putting all that together. Now, if I remember correctly, you've also worked with other African wildlife, haven't you?
I started working actually on forest elephants, and that was my master's thesis at the University of Maryland. And I worked with a researcher who used to be at the Wildlife Conservation Society, Steve Blake, and he actually had put GPS radio collars on about 36 different forest elephants all throughout the Congo Basin. And I was able to use that telemetry data to develop a similar type of model predicting the relative suitability for forest elephant habitat across the whole Congo Basin. That was my master's work.
Does it paint a similar picture to the results from the bonobo studies?
You know, it was actually much more coarse scale, and it was for a much bigger area. It was for the whole Congo Basin, whereas this model for the bonobo is just for a small area in northern DRC. So I actually haven't compared them. The two models actually create different outputs, so I'm not sure how comparable they actually will be, but that would be interesting.
Are there plans to make this kind of data publicly available, for example, like on Google Earth or something like that, so people can actually go on the internet and see where all the bonobos are?
Actually, the Max Planck Institute maintains a database called the APES database that hosts all of a variety of observation data and spatial data related to all of the great apes across the globe. And so our plans are to make this model available for download on the APES database. And all of the observation data that were used as an input to the model are also available from the database, also from Max Planck Institute.
Okay, so on the one hand, you're heavily involved in these programs like habitat suitability mapping for various African wildlife species. But then on the other side, you're also working closely with the local human populations and developing things like participatory mapping programs. So can you talk a little bit about that?
The work that we're doing with the African Wildlife Foundation, we're recognized by the DRC government in 2009 as a pilot model for national level land use planning in the country. So they have now recognized the need for land use plans. So the participatory mapping is working with those local communities to secure land management rights.
Oh, okay.
So that they can be formally recognized by the government of the DRC.
It sounds like, just from the name of it though, that you're letting them kind of do the mapping.
We are. It's participatory mapping.
So they kind of collect the data for you, and then you're the one that facilitates it and puts it in the database and does the analysis.
Exactly. We ask them to draw, basically to translate their own local knowledge of their own geography of where they live onto a sheet of paper. Sometimes they begin drawing in the dirt or in the sand. Wow. But eventually, the map is transferred to a very large format piece of paper. And the map, we guide them through the process because the villagers have never really seen a map or done mapping in the past. So we have to guide them through the process and ask them for, prompt them for drawing what they see in how they define their village, the features that define their village geographically. So we ask them, for example, to draw the road that their village is located on, and we ask for the geographic direction of that road, whether it's north, south, east, or west. And then usually we ask them next to place the location of the chief's house on the map, and that sort of helps them to understand the relationship of all of the other features in relationship to the
It sounds kind of like a cognitive experiment.
It is a cognitive
reason
experiment
about spatial relations.
in a lot of ways, yeah. And then we ask them questions about, well, maybe where is your community farm? Where is your cemetery?
Okay.
And from there, and we also ask about locations of major rivers and locations of features that we might be able to see on a satellite image. So those are rivers, maybe hills, any kind of feature, topographical feature. And so then as a team, we transcribe all of that local knowledge that's been conveyed on paper to a satellite image. And we do that in the presence of the villagers. Actually, we have them do it.
Oh, cool.
So first what we have to do is explain what they are seeing in the satellite image and explain the how the satellite image is captured, because they have never really thought about a satellite in the sky taking pictures of the Earth before. And with these satellite images, you see a lot of different colors due to the wave bands. And so we explain what they are seeing in the colors. And often you can see the locations of the agricultural fields. They're very easy to distinguish because the spectral response of the bare ground is very different from the spectral response of the vegetated forest. So we can start seeing the boundaries between the forest and the agricultural areas. And the goal of the mapping is actually for them to start delineating the boundary of where they historically do their agricultural activities, which we cannot understand from just looking at a satellite image. So their local knowledge is really key in actually formulating those boundaries and delineating them. And once those boundaries are delineated, we are working with the government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo to formalize those boundaries and to allow those people to now have land management rights of those lands.
So one of the things that really struck me earlier on in this Africa-Asia platform symposium that Dr. Furici has jointly set up was during a presentation by Jeff Dupont from the African Wildlife Foundation. And he was talking about this probably, or in relation to this, how rather than trying to force conservation of areas on like a really, really broad scale to exclude people from their local areas, it was more like determine areas that could potentially be protected completely versus areas that the people are using and can sustainably use versus areas that can be accessed by anybody. So that was it was an interesting perspective, I think, one that's maybe often overlooked, because it's not that we need to exclude people completely. So maybe this is very relevant to that.
I would say that this whole project that I've been involved with the African Wildlife Foundation in this particular landscape, the Moringa-Lepori-Wamba landscape, the real premise has been that we cannot achieve conservation without working with those local communities and directly trying to improve their livelihoods. And so the land use planning that we're doing in this landscape is really, first of all, it's a participative process. So we are involving all of the local communities and all of the stakeholders in the landscape. And we also are doing what is called a quid pro quo kind of process. And that means, you give something and in exchange you receive something else in exchange. So with these communities that we're doing the participatory mapping with, we actually have agreements. The purpose of the zoning, creating these boundaries between the agriculture and the forest areas, is so that it's really to decrease deforestation in the primary forest. In Central Africa and in the DRC in particular, human communities live around the roads and they farm outwards away from the roads. And using satellite imagery, we're able to monitor the expansion of agriculture and slash and burn activity. And we can see that it's going farther and farther away from the roads and encroaching into the primary forest. From a conservation standpoint, it's concerning to be losing primary forest, but also from a human livelihood standpoint, it means that the farmers and the local villagers are walking farther and farther to access their farms than they were in the past. So what we're doing is we've teamed up with the International Center for Agroforestry and Tropical Agriculture, CIAT, and we are helping those communities to increase their agricultural production within the defined agricultural zone. And in exchange, they agree to not expand their agriculture further into the primary forest. So we are assisting with soil fertility and helping with their crop rotation patterns, and bringing in seeds for agroforestry. And then the participatory mapping, we're not only defining the agricultural zones, but we're also defining the areas where people historically collect their non-timber forest products. So we're actually formalizing land rights for agricultural development, but also for community forests.
Oh, so for like medicine and mushrooms
for
and
fuel
stuff.
wood and bushmeat hunting and
Okay.
mushrooms and fruits that they get from the
Interesting.
forest.
So, is there any kind of overlap between these two? It sounds like they're very distinctive projects, the Bonobo database and the human land use management, but they're also happening in the same kind of country. So, is there any kind of overlap for you between these different projects? From a conservation standpoint, you can better know how the bonobos are distributed and use that for your land use plans or anything like that.
Yeah, so one role that I have in this project with the African Wildlife Foundation is to use spatial modeling and spatial data to assist them in prioritization of conservation areas within the landscape. So I help them to identify where protected areas should be, for example, and also to look at where community forests might be important for local communities, and also identifying perhaps where key wildlife corridors might be located between the protected areas and the intact forest areas. So, the work that I do with the bonobos links into that very well, because with this whole consortium of bonobo researchers coming together for this bonobo model that we've been leading, it's really important data and information, because the landscape that I'm working in is actually about 20% of the bonobo range in the north. So we can use all of that data as input into more refined models for the landscape to understand which areas are most important for bonobo habitat, and then to do more on-the-ground activities with local communities in those areas.
So getting back to the symposium a little bit, it sounds like a lot of what you do is, in addition to the research and the GIS work, it's educational and facilitative for local people. Here, one of your main roles at the symposium is to lead these workshops in GIS modeling and teaching the software basically, and the system and the ideology behind it. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, So
capacity building has also been a really big part of my work. At the University of Maryland, my research group, we are funded by U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, in a program called CARPE, the Central African Regional Program for the Environment. And one of our biggest parts of CARPE, besides forest monitoring and using satellite imagery to analyze forest change in the Congo Basin, is also capacity building for spatial tools and for forest monitoring in the region. And since about 2002, we have been working very closely with a group that's coming out of the University of Kinshasa of younger geography students who are really wanting to learn GIS and remote sensing and use these tools. And since 2002, we've been sort of providing oversight to their group and creating a laboratory called OSFAC, which is an acronym in French for their group. But they've become now the focal point of GIS and spatial data acquisition, satellite imagery distribution for Central African projects located in the Congo Basin countries.
How important is it imparting the knowledge and having it done locally?
Very important. I can lend my assistance to all of these projects, but I live in the United States and I don't speak the local language. My French is just intermediate level or less. So really, the people who live in the DRC are the ones who really need to be doing this kind of work, and they need the tools in order to solve the problems that are happening in their country.
Well, Janet, thanks for joining us here on the PrimateCast.
Thanks a lot. It was really fun.
You have been listening to the PrimateCast, a podcast series dedicated to the study and conservation of primates around the world. Brought to you by the Centre for International Collaboration and Advanced Studies in Primatology of the Primate Research Institute of Kyoto University. Visit us online at www.cicaspr.pu.ac.jp/news/podcasts and follow us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/theprimatecast and on Twitter at theprimatecast.